Okay.
Okay, Dennis, you were born on the 19th of October, 1945 at Elwyn Hospital in National City, California. What I'd like for you to do is talk a little bit about mom and dad at that time, maybe a little bit about them, and then talk about whatever you feel like talking about pertaining to that particular time.
Yeah, you know, I don't really have, I was too young. I really don't have any memories. I think my first real memories come in when we're in Canada. I can remember we lived in housing that was taken out in I think in the late 50s, early 60s, but it was military housing too, right in the middle of Chula Vista. And they put in a shopping center. In fact, there was that place that Aunt Lizzie used to like to take us to, where they had that wonderful barbecue. That shopping center was set right on the area where we lived.
Crescent Pitts, that was.
Yeah, yeah. But that whole shopping center was built right on top of where that military housing was that was later taken out. But I don't really have any memories of that period. I've looked at the pictures. I remember Mom saying to me that she was kind of disappointed she didn't get a little girl, and so she let my hair grow out pretty long and dressed me in girls' clothes. And in fact, that one picture of me as a 1 or 2 year old, I look like a little girl. My hair's long and I'm wearing kind of a frilly collar thing. So I always thought that was kind of different, you know, that Mom did that. But I don't have any direct memories of that time. I don't.
Okay, let's go on beyond your actually being born there.
Yeah.
And you've already mentioned that you did move to Edmonton, Alberta, Canada.
Yeah.
Tell us everything that you can remember about that you think might be pertinent.
Well, just according to your prompt today, I do remember going up on a train, although that may be later. So I'm not sure my memory of the train is from San Diego to Edmonton. I think my memory of the train is later when we go up to Vallejo, so I won't bring that in. But I remember how cold it was, and I remember being pulled on a sled. Dad was pulling us, and Bobby was sitting in the back, and I was sitting forward in between his legs. He was pulling us in the sled, and I believe we were being pulled to church. He actually pulled us to church on the sled, but I may be wrong about that. Dad told me years later that out in that real windy, you know, up there that part of Canada, those wide open plains, that wind blows really cold across that area, and so you get a real wind chill factor. And so Dad told me that he was actually carrying me, and I can remember Dad actually physically carrying me, but Dad said, I turned to him and said, "Daddy, I'm a cold baby." And Dad laughed about that for years. He thought that was the funniest thing, you know. But I do remember going to what must have been a Christmas party in a church. It was actually in a church. And we were sitting on the, as you face the front of the church, we were sitting in the pews, the row on the left side, about halfway down. And of course, there's adults, and I can barely see over their heads. But I remember that Santa Claus motioned for a little girl to go on up there on the stage, and she went up there, and I lost sight of her. But the next thing I saw was he was reaching through a hole. There was a hole on the stage, and he must have had somebody behind handing him toys for the kids. But out of this hole, a hand emerges with a doll. And boy, I figured that out real quick. That person has turned that little girl into a doll. And so I'm just freaked. I mean, I was sitting there like, wow. And when he motioned to me, I just burst out in tears. No, I'm not going. Mommy, I'm not going. It's just one of those numbers. And Mom said, years later when I talked to Mom about it, she said, I wondered why you were so upset. I said, yeah, I thought he was going to turn me into something. That's why I was so frightened. But the house itself, now Phil tells me that we lived in 3 different houses. I probably only remember the last house. But I do remember that it had this, I mean, it was a long, and it was a wooden stair, and it kind of came up, and then there was a landing, and then, you know, it was quite a thing to get up that stairs. But once you got through that door, I remember high in the door, there was an oval window maybe about that big, maybe an inch high, and maybe 10 inches wide. It was a elongated, but I always remember that oval, not oval, that diamond window in the door, and it was right there up in the right as you came up into that area. You were also in the kitchen, and I remember Mom a lot ironing, and that was probably because in those days, of course, Dad was back in the service, and you have to look crisp. You have to have iron seams, and that's the mark of a well-groomed soldier. And so I expect a lot of Mom's time was spent ironing Dad's uniforms, as I recall. But if you went kind of out of the kitchen, there was rooms this way, but there was also kind of a hallway that came around to the top of stairs that went down into a room down below. And I can remember standing at the rail and looking down in the room down below, but I do not remember ever seeing anybody down there. All I saw was a dark room. I remember seeing a couch down there and other front room accoutrements, but never did I see anybody. But it was this curious thing to stare down into this kind of pit. And I remember one time starting down the stairs and Mom calling me back that I couldn't go down there. So there wasn't an actual barrier between our area and the area down below that separated us. It wasn't like a doorway or something. The separation was simply the stairs to go downstairs. I do remember that much.
Anything else about Edmonton?
Not really. Not really. I guess over the years those are the memories I've retained, and probably told myself about them just to keep them in my memory. I think otherwise they would have gone. But yes, the memories were limited, very, very limited.
Okay. Now in September of 1947, Dad received orders and we returned to the States. And at first he was briefly at Hamilton Field, later Hamilton Air Force Base. And also at that time, of course, they bought that apartment in Vallejo.
Yes.
Tell us about that period of time in your life.
I don't think they bought that apartment. I think they
No, it was rented. It was
a rented
military
apartment.
housing. It was military housing.
Yeah. Well, of course, they were parallel rows. The parts that faced each other, that this set here had staircases, and this set here had staircases, and the distance between them was a rather broad lawn. There was a nice broad lawn there, and there was even a catch of trees between the apartments. And that picture of me on the pony that I use on my my album, my first album, that was taken right in front of the trees in that lawn area right there in Vallejo. That's where that picture was taken. But it was kind of fun to go down under the steps and play, but Mother, when she caught me down there, she'd shoo me right out. Dennis, there's black widow spiders down there, So I couldn't really spend much time there. I do remember in front of our, and on the back side of these apartments, the back doors of the next row faced us, and that was a really, really narrow area there. It was a sidewalk, a short yard, and then the back of the houses. So the areas back to back was very narrow. The area face to face was a very wide area with the lawn and everything. I do remember that. And I remember I got my first pair of roller skates, and I remember there was a neighbor girl who had a pair of roller skates. She was on the back side of the house, and I can remember skating up and down, around, up and down and around, and she was doing the same thing. That was one of the kind of cool things. But it had a bit of a scare. A little boy down right on the street got hit by a car. I don't know if you knew that.
I was aware of it.
Was killed right out there in front of our row of apartments, and from that point on, I was always a little afraid to go near the street. That was kind of scary, and when it came time for me to walk to school, that was kind of spooky. And in fact, when I headed for school, I can remember that you walked right out to Olympic, and then it was straight as an arrow. You just right to the school, Olympic School. But I was just recently looking at a map. Once you get past the school, that whole neighborhood is torn out. It's completely gone. The street names are different, everything else. The street name in front of the school remains Olympic, but as soon as you hit the first intersection, it goes into a neighborhood that was built into where the housing were. And Olympic went straight as an arrow. You know how the military lay out their streets. But the street that replaces it actually goes kind of off at an angle. It goes off an angle this way. And so when I visited that years ago and looked at that, I couldn't determine if our house would have been on this side of the street or whether the angle was such that our house would have ended up in the middle of the street or on this side, because that street doesn't go straight, and it has a different name. It's not called Olympic. So to actually pinpoint where our house was, I think would be impossible today. But I do remember that straight street. I remember when I started kindergarten, Mom bought me a Mackinac, a red and black rack. It looks like sort of like my bathrobe, actually. And to this day, I've never been a big fan of red and black Mackinac patterns. I hated that thing. To me, it was just ugly, you know. And so I was embarrassed to go to school in this red and black Mackinac. Fuzzy, it was warm. I give them that. They bought me a nice warm jacket. So I cried and fussed about that much more than I needed to, you know. But I kind of got used to it. And I can remember kindergarten. They had these great big blocks. I mean, they were wooden blocks, but they were chunky. They were big. Well, of course, I was 5. Maybe they were only this big. You know how that is. But I remember building myself a little house and sitting in my little house. I was so proud of it. And then some other student came along and pushed it over on me. And I don't think I cried. I think I just got upset. I got kind of mad about it. And I don't really remember my teacher. And that's a real problem. We changed schools so many times that I just kind of kept checking out. Once I left a place, bye-bye memory, just move on to the next. But yeah, as you walked on your way to school, as you got into the next set of houses, which did the same thing, they parallel on both sides of the streets. Right at next set down, as I went to school, at the end of that series of 4, there was a series of 4 apartments, some of the kids got to playing cowboys and Indians, and they decided to go under the house and build an Indian campfire. And they burned the fourth apartment badly, and I think it damaged the next one up too. But I can remember that poor old black charcoal thing, you know, and the kids that did that were only about a year or 2 ahead of me. They were so older boys, yeah, but they burned one of the apartments right off the end. And I remember in Vallejo, as you walk down Olympic and you get past the school, the road would curve dramatically. And then there was another street, and then there was another street, and that was kind of the end of the track, was our street, another street, and another street. And right at the end of that curve where those 2 streets met, there was a little store. It was like kind of the equivalent of a 7-Eleven, but in those days it was a private little store there. And I remember that Dad would go in there to buy things. I think it's where he bought his cigarettes in those days and stuff. But I would go in there with him, and I remember going in there one time and looking around, and I saw this really cute little car. I thought it was really neat, and so I kind of just glommed onto it. And we left and got back to the car, and Dad saw it and he said, "Where did you get that?" In there. Dad got me out of the car with my little car, took me back into the store, had me give the car back to the man and apologize for stealing the car. I was so mortified. I don't know if I've ever told you that story. But if you went, if Olympic, as it continued the other way, straight, if you went down, it also reached about, there was one cross street and another cross street, and then I remember going down again, our street, first street, the 3rd street. Mom was having problems with Bobby in those days. And it was a real problem. She wanted to find other mothers for support. It was tough. It was really tough for her. And of course, doctors in those days couldn't really diagnose what was going on with Bobby. and it's only in our modern times that autism is understood. They thought he had schizophrenia, they thought he had this, that, and the other, but my personal opinion, seeing it all from the modern perspective, Bob was severely autistic. And so she went to a mother support group, and they had a meeting right down there at that street. There was just a short little park, and the mothers would all come together with their children. The problem was there was no other autistic kids. They were all Down syndrome. And so she was trying to relate, I remember she was trying to relate to these mothers, and it was even obvious to me at that age that they weren't behaving like Bobby, they were something different, you know. So even in Mom's attempt to try and find support, mostly people didn't understand where Bobby fit in, and they referred her to a bunch of mothers dealing with Down syndrome. And I was just very much remember Mom's sense of kind of loneliness and not finding a place where she really could relate. It was tough. She was in a lot of ways just very much alone at that period of time. And I remember if you went down to the next cross street and went uphill, that at the top of the hill, where there was other military housing, it was kind of in tiers. Ours was here, and then there was the hill that went up where I would ride my wagon, as you say. But then there was another neighborhood just like ours up above. But if you went one street down and went to the top of the hill, that track ended, and there was this kind of big open sandy area, and right in the middle of the sandy area there was a pond. And in that pond there was an area where you had, it was kind of mushy and white, and we were warned, I remember as kids, not to get too close to the pond because there was quicksand. A person called it quicksand, or whether it was really quicksand or not, but if you stepped to the edge of it, boy, your feet started sinking right into it. So I was real cautious about going up to the flat where the sand was and where the quicksand was. And that's another memory I have. I remember traveling. I remember bringing that fish home as you described, and of course in those days the old cars had a big hump in the middle. That's where the
transmission.
Yeah, well, the drivetrain went.
Just, yeah.
Drivetrain went right through that from the transmission to the rear end, and that's why you had those big humps. And they were high humps. To me, it was a very high hump. And so I was actually sitting on the right side of the car in the back, and they draped the fish over the hump, and the head's turned like this, and he's looking right at me. All the way home, I look at him, and I turn my head back, and then I look again. He's still looking at me. It was one of those kind of things all the way home. And I can remember us traveling out one time and going across the Golden Gate Bridge in a high wind. And I can remember the bridge swaying, and it was scary. It was kind of, oh, you know, and me, what do I know? But I can remember the Golden Gate Bridge actually swaying in a high wind. And then I can remember from where we lived in Vallejo, if you went right down to the first main road, that's now Highway 37. That's the same road that goes directly to Sonoma, and also to eventually right up there to close to where what's his name, Jack London, that site is up there. So I remember going up that road out of, once you got on 37, you got into a marsh area, and off to your left you were passing the end of Mare Island, where they built all the submarines for all back. You know, they were building submarines in those days at Mare Island. That's what they did. And in fact, I think they built submarines there until the early 60s. That was a major place to build submarines. But once you got across the little bit of waterway, there was just marsh, and the road was kind of a raised road. It was a two-lane road, marsh on this side, marsh on that, and it's still like that.
I was just going to say,
it's still like that to this day. It's never changed, and it's still a two-lane road. It's the same road I remember when I was 5. But that would take you up to Sonoma. And I can remember I remember Bobby and I sitting in the car while Mom and Dad went into Vallejo's house. You know, Vallejo built a wooden house. Not you would think adobe, but no, he had a wooden house, and he was an experimenter with hydroponics hydroponics and water systems, everything. The guy was rather a jack of all trades kind of a person. And I can remember, yeah, he was very much ahead of his time. It's a shame that when they did that Bear Flag Republic thing up there, the first thing they did was arrest him. And they eventually let him go, but they mistreated him during that time period. But, and I remember the town square, I remember Vallejo's house, and then I can remember going into the hills north of that in the direction of Santa Rosa, but I don't really much remember that. I can remember going to Gurneyville. I can remember that whole episode with the raft. And
Tell a little more about it, because they don't know this.
oh, okay. Well, so I remember Dad in those days, he was still a lean and mean fighting machine. He wasn't heavy. Dad in a bathing suit was muscular, you know, and he was starting to lose his hair. But I can remember Dad was, you know, Dad had no compunctions about going off and showing his, you know, himself in a bathing suit. He was very fit, and I remember he had been swimming at the shore, and this raft that was carrying people from one side of the Russian River to the other started, and I saw people get on. I thought, well, that's great fun. I jump on the raft. So I'm right on the edge. I'm the last person on. I think I jumped on as an afterthought. And we got out in the middle of the river, and all of a sudden I heard Dad call. He says, "Dennis," or something like that. And I turned and I saw him. Oh, and I jumped off the raft towards Dad. Down I went. And I sat on the bottom, had my eyes open. I'm looking around. I don't remember panicking. I don't remember sucking for air or sucking water. I just sat on the bottom and I looked around. You know, how curious. Next thing you know, Dad's on top of me. He's got me, pulls me up. He takes me to shore. But the reason I jumped off the raft is because he saw me and called to me, which was a mistake on his part. Well, he wouldn't have known that I would have then responded to go to him and jump off the raft, you know. But we also would go camping in the redwoods. I remember being put on an old army cot, an old folding canvas army cot with a pile of blankets. I think they were army blankets too. And they put me right up against a redwood tree. And I remember waking up in the morning and a beautiful sky, and I'm looking straight up through a redwood tree. And that's one of my earliest memories of a redwood tree. And I've always loved redwood trees, I think, because of that. Because there I am looking up through this incredibly glorious and elevated tree, you know. It's a very, very special memory at that time. Really?
Same memory.
Really?
I remember that. I have no context for it, but I remember camping, sleeping on a cot like that, with the brown army blankets, and waking up and yes.
Looking up through the trees.
It was like me describing it. It was just hearing that, I went, whoa! Because I was very young.
Yeah. Now, I don't remember ever going over to Hamilton Air Force Base. I do remember the Tompkins, Donna Tompkins.
Let's talk about her when we get to Edwards.
Well, okay.
You can talk about her now, but
Yeah, but I do have a memory of her, and I had a little bit of a crush on her even then, you know, that in my mind's eye. And I remember we would go down into the town of Vallejo. Mom and Dad had I think Mom picked it. She had a favorite Chinese restaurant. And you know, it was just kind of this long, shacky building, kind of the lowlands, before there's a rise in the elevation and then you go into town. And it was in kind of might have been a river wash at some time, but this thing was, as you went south into town from our house, it was on the left side. And what we often would do, we'd order egg foo young. Remember, egg foo young with gravy on it, and how much I liked that at the time. That was one of the things we went to and ate. And it's funny because when I was traveling with Carolyn Dieter after we were married, we went up to Vallejo and dipped down into that valley, and that building was still there in 1969, that Chinese restaurant. So we stopped and had lunch there, actually at the very same place where we had lunch as we were growing up. But they had changed the building. Originally, the eating area was on the south end of the building, and the kitchen was on this end. And then they moved the kitchen. When we went back, it seemed they had moved the kitchen to the other end and opened up a bigger area for it. So they had changed it internally, but it was still a Chinese restaurant. I think it was still run by the same family. And if we get a chance to get up there, I've looked for it in recent times, and they have torn much stuff out of there, and they've rebuilt a bunch, unless it's hidden behind a higher building now. It may still be there, but it may not. But it was there in 1969, the very same place that we would go for Chinese food. Yeah.
Do you have memories, like maybe the Cliff House or Seal Rock or Fort Ross or Golden Gate Park or I don't know, just what kinds of things do you remember?
Well, I remember Fort Ross. Well, you know, they've changed it a lot. In the old days, the coastal road went right through the fort, and so that meant the headquarters house, which would have been normally right in the center of the fort, was gone. The Greek Orthodox Church was there, but then that burned down later. But I remember the original one.
But yeah, I went there as a very small baby, so I know you did.
Yeah.
Because Mom talked about you guys were winding, and you wind like crazy to get up there, and I got car sick.
Oh, you still can get. I got car sick on those roads myself, and as an adult. You know, riding you know, if I'm not in the front seat, if I'm in the back seat where the car is swaying, I'm a goner.
Yeah, that's
if
why
I'm driving, I'm okay.
Yeah, that's why I suspected
Yeah.
you had memories, because I know I went there, and I was 3 years younger.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember going to the Cliff House, but that was a going concern in those days. I remember they had a place on the back side of the Cliff House with all these slot machines and mechanical toys from the 1800s. Do you remember those? All those?
Oh yeah, penny arcades.
Penny
too,
arcades.
Just all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, there was all kinds of stuff down there. I don't know if it's still there or whether they've moved that stuff out.
They did have a fire since then, and whether it's rebuilt, I don't know.
Yeah. But as far as the outward excursions, I don't have a lot of memories of that. I don't. I do remember going up to Sonoma and seeing Vallejo's house. I do remember the things I've already described, but I don't have a lot of other things. If I were prompted in a certain way, maybe something would pop up, but that's about it.
Mm-hmm. Stop it. Okay, Dennis, there's a few things from that Vallejo period that we haven't talked about. In 1948, we went down for the Campbell reunion. It was the first time actually that Uncle Jack and Uncle Red had seen each other since before the war.
Yeah.
And everybody gathered down there. And Grandpa had done some work in a duct and had left some wood shavings. And Ray Banks and Uncle Red were working on that. And they caught that on fire. And you remember that fire. It was about September of 1948. Tell us about that.
Well, all I really remember of that is being hastily grabbed up in a blanket, just wrapped in a blanket and grabbed, taken out of the house. There was a bus bench right on the corner there in an old-fashioned, and they put me on the bus bench, and I sat there on the bus bench and watched the firemen up on the roof. They were putting out a fire, I guess, and that much I knew about it. And that was before they built all those other houses across the street. That was all lemon groves, as I recall. From the house as far as you could see, that block was all lemon groves. But I remember just sitting there as a child watching firemen, come and hoses and coming up the ladders and, the whole drama of a fire thing, not exactly understanding what was going on, but that's what I saw,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Another thing that happened when we were there on the 20th of May, 1950, your grandmother Campbell passed away. Now, I know you had memories of your grandmother Campbell. She'd come, she'd read to you.
No, even before that.
Yeah. Let's talk about her and all of your memories about her.
Well, I remember that when you went into the house, I remember that for some reason she was sleeping downstairs. They had moved her bed as you went in the back door, here's the kitchen off to your left, go in the back door, and then there's that kind of a wide hallway, and then here's the stairs that go upstairs, you know, the stairs that Mom came down when she was married. But they had moved her bed in that little atrium between the back door, the kitchen, and up to the stairs. And I can remember her propped up in the bed. I can remember her sitting in the bed. And I can remember how skinny she was. And I can remember she had really buck teeth like Aunt Lizzie, you know, but she looked almost skeletal at that time. But even before that, I can remember one time being there with Johnny, sitting on the back porch, and she had these molds for making popsicles, and her bringing a popsicle out to Johnny and I. We ate the popsicle that grandmother handed to us right there on the back porch. Very clear memory of that, of her giving us each a popsicle. Mm-hmm. And I remember we went down there for the funeral, and Mom, I was in one room by myself. Mom was in another room. I don't know if Dad went down or not, I don't remember. But I remember grandmother coming into me in the bedroom, and there was a lamp on the nightstand. It was a globe supported by 3 silver elephants. Do you remember that, the elephant lamp? I've got it in pieces in one of my places. All the solder joints had broken down, but I've kept that lamp because I remember that. The lamp was on, and she came in and sat down on the bed beside me, had me pick up, it was a Fuzzy Wuzzy Bear book, and she read the Fuzzy Wuzzy Bear book to it. She'd have me reach out my hand and feel, because the pages had, you know, the bear, but it was raised fuzz. You know what I'm saying? It was a book, it was a tactile book, and she said, okay, feel the Fuzzy Wuzzy Bear, and I'd feel the Fuzzy Wuzzy Bear, and she read the picture. Mom said that happened the same night that grandmother came to her, that she left, must have left her and come to me, that I may have actually been read to by grandmother from the other side. She wasn't handling the books. She was just, touched the pictures. She was just reading the story to me and kind of comforting me. It's one of those kind of memories that's kind of spooky, because Mom remembers that time and she'd already passed. You know, so I think I had an after-death moment with Grandmother Campbell. Mm-hmm. But I was so young, I can't put all the pieces together on that. But Mother was pretty sure that's when that happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very interesting. Now, in September of 1952, Dad received orders to go to Korea. Yeah. And because he was going to Korea, Mom wanted to go somewhere close to her family. And so we moved to Nestor, which was just a few miles south of Chula Vista and just a few miles north of Tijuana. And Aunt Vera was in a trailer park not far from there. Tell us what you remember about our time in Nestor. And of course you continued school there. We had a pet named Pepto-Bismol there.
Yeah. Well, even before that, I remember when Dad actually left for Korea from San Diego. He left from the San Diego bus station. And I remember we all went down there, the family in the car. And when it was one of these old-fashioned buses, it was real rounded off the back, and you know, old-timey buses, real rounded off. And I remember him getting on the bus. I remember watching him from the car, walking down the aisle, getting a seat to where he could face us, and then lowering the window. And I remember sitting in the car and waving to Dad as he left for Korea, and Mom was crying. And so I remember we headed back down to Chula Vista from the San Diego bus station. Mom was so upset. I don't know what she did wrong, but she got pulled over by a policeman. And I remember she was just sobbing. It's really a difficult time, but I remember watching Dad leave on the bus. I don't know if you remember that or not.
Yeah, actually, I do. I remember the ticket, which she didn't get. She explained what was going on, and he said, I'm going to let you have a warning. She was so upset that before we actually went home, we stopped at Aunt Vera's, and Aunt Vera kind of comforted her a little bit.
Well, Aunt Vera was further south at that. wasn't she?
Aunt Vera was just between Chula Vista and Nestor.
Yeah, but that's further south than if she were going home from San Diego, she would have hit Chula Vista before she got down to Aunt Vera's.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she went to Aunt Vera's, and then we went home. In fact, I remember two.
See, I don't remember that segment. But
Yeah, and I remember that. That wasn't too different from the time that Uncle Buck was there. Remember Buck? And he had left the military. He was AWOL, and he was feigning that he had amnesia. And we were there when they were talking to him in the other room, trying to, don't you remember this? And don't you remember that? But anyway, I don't want to get into this. This is your life, not Uncle Buck.
But I have the very, very clear memories of driving up there, of him getting on the bus, watching him. I could see him moving down the aisle, and I remember him being seated and at the window. So I'm watching him, and we're waving to him as Dad leaves. I don't know if you remember that, the bus sequence.
By the way, that's all written in here, and I didn't read it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, even the just getting stopped, the whole thing. Going to Aunt Vera's is not in here, but it's a vivid memory, and I was tiny. So why?
Well, I remember Aunt Vera at other times, but not then.
Yeah. She was just in tears when she got there, and Aunt Vera comforted her.
Oh, my mom was really distraught. And that was really a difficult time. Nestor, well, you know, it was right on that road that led up to that great big airfoil on
the wing standing
the
up.
wing that stood up on the top of the hill there to commemorate. Well, in fact, the name of the street wasn't we were living on was the name of that fellow, wasn't it? What was the name of the street, Nestor?
It was called. I can stop it before I find it. It was called 2466 Coronado Avenue, Nestor.
No, that wasn't the name of the pilot, or it was a glider, one of the first glider things. But you know, that house was a duplex. Do you remember that? I visited that house with Carolyn Dieter in '68 or '69, and they were in the act of tearing it down. We arrived, and they were actually tearing the house down. I actually saw it being dismantled. So that house is no longer there. But there was the duplex in the front, and then there was a drive that went back. There were other houses in the back, other people living on that property.
He had moved houses onto the property to rent them.
Oh, is that how he did it?
He ran racehorses. Anyway, this is not about me. I'll stop.
Yeah, that's fine. Is this going now? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And there was a swing in the front yard. There was a back porch with a great big laundry tub, and that's where we would swim Pepto-Bismol, you know, the duck. And but you know, the most vivid memory of that place was not a happy memoy for me.
When Bob had that situation,
yeah, Bob
caught himself in
he caught himself in the zipper, and he was just howling and screaming. Well, Mom went in there and freed him up, but because it was a duplex, the people on the other half of the duplex called the police. And so here comes two policemen to the door, and they're saying, "Lady, you know, as he's trying to explain that." And this, well, you know, you need to keep this kid quiet. You know, and then he said something really brutal. Something, well, you know, there's a place for kids like that. You know, that kind of stuff. And he's looking at Bobby, and he's looking at me, and he's looking at you, like here's a single woman, policeman, and they were not kind the way they handled Mom.
They did not have sensitivity training back then.
They did not. Police did not have sensitivity. Look, and I felt they were looking at me like, is this one a nut too? You know.
I felt that a lot of times.
But they were looking at us like there
During
was a
those
single
years.
woman with a bunch of kids, and what is this whole thing? When they left, remember that Chase Lounge that set right off to, here's the front doorway, and there was a Chase Lounge. Mom went over on the Chase Lounge, just collapsed in tears. And I kind of tried to comfort her. You got on top of her. We all kind of snuggled up with her and tried to just comfort Mom after that experience. I remember all of us kids just kind of snuggled there in her arms, and as we were trying to comfort our Mom after the policeman left. It was a very sad moment, very sad memory.
That was really unkind of the neighbors.
Well, people, people didn't, the attitude towards mental health in the old days is like it was some kind of horrible disease and it's your family's fault, not mine, People, people didn't know how to deal with it, and so they dealt with it badly, generally speaking, and that was true up in Vallejo, and that advisor sent us down with those Down syndrome kids, people didn't understand. They didn't even know what to call it. They didn't know it was autism, and of course that's Bobby's story. You probably have a lot of that stuff too. But I remember that time after the policeman left, and Mom just sobbing, and all three of us wrapped around her trying to console her. That hurt. That was a hard evening. I don't know if you have memories of that or not.
Well, you'll notice that I immediately said that incident.
Yeah.
He caught himself in his zipper. It was
His
just
foreskin and his zipper, and yeah.
He took a turn for the worse that very day.
Bobby did?
Very, very much. He was never the same after that day.
To me, I didn't see it that way. He was pretty much the same. We would play in the front yard together, Bobby and I, and his favorite thing was to pick up a stick. He'd sit on the front porch there and Nestor, and he'd hit it on the ground. Na 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 na. And you ask him a question, he'd say, na 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 na. Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? Big na 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 na. I don't know if you remember that.
Asking you questions about the greyhound dog and
the greyhound dog.
Yeah. No, I those are vivid memories.
Yeah.
My Bobby memories are vivid, very early.
Yeah, yeah. And eventually, when we moved, I remember we ended up giving the duck. Was it somebody that Vera knew, or was it it was somebody who had ducks. I remember taking Pepto-Bismol and turning him loose. 5 minutes later, it was mixed in with the other ducks, and you couldn't tell
which duck he was.
You couldn't tell which duck he was. Right? Yeah, exactly. But it was an easy walk to school because you walk right out the front door up the hill. School was up on the hill, and Mom would pack me liverwurst sandwiches, and to this day I love liverwurst. But yeah, with 2 pieces of bread, a little mayonnaise on one, a little mustard on the other, big slab of liverwurst and a pickle or 2, and that was my lunch at school. Mm-hmm. And I can remember I had a teacher there that sort of decided that she liked me, and I became kind of her teacher's pet. And so for a short period of time while we were there, I could do no wrong in the classroom, which was my moment to glory. I can remember making things out of clay and putting them up on top of the cabinets to dry, and I remember making a little clay half-track, like a military half-track, so I was already stigmatized by armor at that age, But I do remember that. But she really, she kind of watched out for me and doted on me. I became kind of her teacher's pet for a moment in time. I wish I could remember her name, just because, for one moment in time, I meant something to somebody, in that kind of way. Mm-hmm. But I'm trying to, and I remember going up on the hill with that wing and going right up there as a kid and looking at it close up. I can remember visiting Aunt Vera very much at that period of time, and their house was never complete. It was always a work in progress, They were always building a new room addition, or they hadn't bothered to put the sheetrock on the walls in some of the rooms, and it was always that way. And Uncle Andy, he was a character, and I can remember at that point their grandchildren. Was that Tom? Who? Their children or grandchildren? Tommy? Who was that? Maybe that's later. Maybe that's before we go to Japan. But I can remember visiting Uncle Andy and Aunt Vera. Trying to think what else really clicks in that time period. I have other memories before we go to Japan which are a bit clearer. Yeah.
Well, we have pictures of us on that string set. You know, we had a TV by then. We watched like Sheriff John's Lunch Brigade and those kinds of things.
Black and white, and a picture that kept flipping and flipping and flipping. You always had to adjust the, and it wouldn't stay adjusted for long. And, you know, and I don't know what they finally did in the television industry to, but that was just part of the definition. If you owned a television, you were always correcting the horizontal or the vertical, and
It was a horizontal hold button and a horizontal and a vertical hold button, and you do it. She read to us a lot. Oz books were something I remember.
yeah.
Talk about that.
Well, yeah, and all those books, The Wizard of Oz, The Land of Oz. See that cabinet up there? They're all up in there. Not hers, not her original ones, but like Lucky Bucky and Oz. Remember that?
That's the one with the whale.
The whale. I've got a copy of that up in that. That's almost a complete copy of all the things that Baum wrote, plus a lot that other people did. But yeah, that's where I really developed a love for the Oz books. Reading them now as an adult, they're very formulaic. I mean, he creates a formula and he does the same thing over and over and over. And pretty soon you're kind of going, ho hum, you've read them. And now there's some people that criticize them for, there's some racism which seemed to be endemic in those days. It's kind of woven into it too. But as a child, you don't see that. You just saw the exciting story. And Mombi the Witch, remember Mombi the Witch, and Tip, he runs away with Jack Pumpkinhead and the Sawhorse to get away from Mombi, who's going to change him into a statue. I remember those sorts of things. And then that memory in Vallejo when I had that earache, and it was so bad that I throbbing, and I was dreaming that ants were marching all over me all night long. But that goes back to Vallejo. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Anything else about the Nestor period? Okay, well, Dad leaves Korea. He actually left Korea on the 27th of August of '53, which means he got there either the very end of August or probably early March. Depends just what kind of transportation he had. He returned at night.
That's right. He came in at night.
And brought you, what did he bring you? Because I want to talk a little bit about this.
Well, he brought me a model of the battleship Missouri. Remember that? But before that time, Grandfather Campbell, he gave these terrific Christmas presents. Remember the Fort Apache?
Yes, and the Banger Busters.
I got that at Nestor, and we'd play together. We had Cowboys and Indians and Banger Busters. We had this alien war going on in the
yeah.
And I've looked online for Banger Busters. Those particular, I've never found. I've seen other plastic spacemen of that period, but never have I found Banger Busters. Mm-hmm. Must have been a limited.
Which is a word we gave to them, but you've never found
that particular toy.
That particular set.
They'd come marching up the fort. Banger, bustard, mustard, custard, banger, bustard, mustard, custard.
Yeah.
Get into this whole thing, with those. But that's before, and I think before we left Vallejo, Grandfather Campbell had already given me that American Flyer train. I think that went clear back to Vallejo, and me, how I love to tinker with stuff. I immediately got a screwdriver and took the engine apart. And I couldn't put it back together. The next time that Grandfather came through, he put it back together, but it was disassembled and set in there. I really messed it up. I thought I could take it apart and put it back together, and I couldn't. Didn't have the skill.
I just remember that American Flyer train very well. You got was it Captain Hook or Clarabelle Clown or marionettes? You bought us marionettes.
Yeah, I remember those, the marionettes.
Yeah.
Now that you mention it. Yeah. There's lots of things, if you mention it, would probably just come alive in a moment. So much of my younger life, I've kind of repressed. And that's probably I've been told that's partly a function of PTSD, is that you repress high energy thoughts, anything that's high energy that might be threatening. So things that from normal people would be high, high end happy memories, because they have lots of energy and they get repressed. And so I suffer a little bit from the PTSD in suppressing and repressing memories. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay,
that's
well,
probably part of why your memories are so much clearer. When I was younger, I had pretty good memory.
you had a great memory. In fact, you're one of the smartest people I ever met. And that has never changed. You've always impressed me. Dad comes home, so he receives orders for Holloman Air Force Base in Alamogordo, New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
We actually moved to Nestor. Can you tell me about Nestor and Alamogordo and the White Sands and
You're
anything
talking about
else?
Nestor, but you're talking about
New
not
Mexico.
Nestor. You're talking about
Tularosa. Did I say Nestor again? Yeah, Tularosa, New Mexico. Yeah, we were in Tularosa, which is a town of about 2,500, not too far from Alamogordo, and that's where we were. And he would commute to work with some other servicemen.
Yeah.
But tell us about that period. You went to school there. You had.
Well, my first memories are in the Clayton house, and it was a nice house. If you went out the back door into the backyard, it was a fairly deep backyard, but there was a fence in the back, and it was just covered with gourds. And I remember going out there, because I had never seen gourds like that grow on a fence. There was great big gourds hanging all over the fence, and they weren't pumpkin, they were gourds, and so I was told that I couldn't eat them. They weren't edible, but they were the kind of gourds you'd make, the Indians might have used to make things. But this whole low fence was covered with gourds, and there was quite a bit of grass in that backyard too. But it was Mom. What I remember most of all was Mom got sick, and it was gallstones, and she was so sick while we were in the Clayton house that she really at times couldn't get up to cook, and she would actually lay in bed and tell me how to peel potatoes and put them in a casserole. Mom taught me to cook from the bed, and you probably wouldn't have remembered that, but there was a period of time when, with her direction, I was putting together a lot of the meals, and stuff, and putting them in the oven, the whole thing. And I remember there's one particular dress that she wore. It was kind of a modern dress, kind of green with kind of slash patterns this way and slash patterns that way. And I remember her getting dressed up in that dress for Sunday? And I remember her being, at one point in time, she was, well, I don't know, kind of private stuff, but I remember her and Dad had some real problems there for a period in that Clayton house, and I remember that was going on at that time. There was some issues that they were having. But, and I remember very well all the irrigation ditches around town that were filled with asparagus. And Mom thought that was something else, because right out in front of the Clayton house, there was a real deep ditch, and the whole side that faced the sun was just covered down this irrigation ditch as far as you could see with asparagus. And Mom loved asparagus, so she was harvesting that all the time. We ate a lot of asparagus in the Clayton house. But when we got over to the other house, she said walls 6 inches thick. No, those walls, there was the main house, and then you stepped down in our room. It was actually excavated. It was about 2 or 3 feet below ground level. If you looked out the window, and here you're standing, here was the ground just right below the window. So that excavation could have been at least 2 feet, maybe 3 feet. That whole thing was sunk down into the earth. And those walls, the windowsills were this deep. So those walls were every bit of a foot thick, not 6 inches. They were every bit of a foot thick. And very insulating because you have cold winters in New Mexico, and that house was toasty. It was always warm. Summer it was always cool, and because you were picking up the temperature of the earth, you know, and with the windows closed, it would maintain itself at pretty much whatever the ground temperature was, you know. And so I always thought after that that I would like to build an adobe house, and my fantasies of, you know, if my life changed dramatically and I had nowhere to go, I'd probably go to New Mexico and build an adobe house. And I always thought that was so neat. And then Carolyn's grandfather built an adobe house in Aptos here, so that was fascinating. But those walls were this thick, easily that thick. And if you went out of the house, okay, here's the road here's the house on the corner. It's on a corner. Here's the road. It's about 2 blocks or so down to the school where I went to school.
Yeah.
And it was a two-story brick schoolhouse, but it had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 rooms in it. There was a hallway down the center, 2 rooms on this side, 2 rooms on this side. Upstairs, 2 rooms on this side, 2 rooms on that side. There was a total of eight classrooms in that building, and then there was a little room that was kind of stubbed off the end, and that was the music room. And I can remember going into the music room, and the teacher would have us sing. That's where I first listened to folk music, you know Jimmy Crackcorn and all the various things that the kids sang. And the teacher would lay her auto harp up on the table, and she would strum the auto harp, and we would sing to the auto harp. We sang all sorts of folk songs. It was sort of like release time for an hour for music. And that's what got me interested. That was my first real glimpse of music. In fact, I was so fascinated by it. I remember going up to the front of the room as the class was ending, and she let me push the buttons and let me strum the auto harp. I was so fascinated with the sound that was coming out of that thing. But it was a little bit of a treacherous street because as you headed from our house down the street, you passed. There was a cul-de-sac that went under the road, and some of the older boys from school would hide down in the cul-de-sac. And one day on my way to school, they shot me with a BB gun, and raised quite a welt on me. And so I went. I think I had gone home for lunch and was going back to school, and I got shot with a BB gun. And Mom went to some effort to try to identify which kids had done it, but it never happened again. But they're just being mean. That was the kind of thing I remember. And I remember if you continued on that same road down about another 4 or 5 blocks, you hit I think what must have been the eastern tip of the main street where all the shops were and the theater was. Remember the time we went there and we saw House of Wax?
Scared me to death.
Oh, Phil had nightmares for days over that thing. It was spooky to me, and I still kept seeing this image of this pretty girl's face with a coating of wax on it. If I think about it, that's the image I see, you know. But it was so frightening, and it was 3D, and that made it.
That's what I was about to say.
That's what made it really worse, because I mean, things were jumping out at you. You know, knives were flying, and all this crazy stuff that they did in those days. But you know, I went back some years back when Carol and I traveled with the kids, and that entire street was just dead as a doornail.
Was when she and I went. That school was there, and
the school's up. It's fenced.
It was
it's got a big
fence
chain
all
link
around.
fence, yeah. Complete.
Not in use.
That fence was not there. It was a wide open field. There was no chain link fence around it. But when I went back, that's what I saw, and it wasn't being used. It obviously been fenced off for vandalism. But that's what I remember of that period. And so I got to be a Cub Scouts, and so I dug a very big Cub Scout garden. I had a huge garden. The street that went straight to the school, the corner where our house was on, my garden was over on this face, on this street facing out. And the house was here. If you went out of the house this way, you went into that hedge of trees where the sofa was sitting, And if you went through those trees into the next yard, there were some older kids there that had put together a bunch of pipes and an electric motor and a drive belt, and they had made a carousel, and it would spin around at a pretty good rate, and I would go over there and ride on their carousel. I don't know if you remember the carousel, but that was where the couch was, through the bushes, and there was this really cool carousel. I thought that was really a neat thing, you know, to motorize your own carousel. So, and I remember going to White Sands. I remember that. I remember us driving to church. Remember that drive from Tularosa to Alamogordo? And there was all these really deep ravines, and where they had those flash floods in New Mexico, and here you'd have these really deep ravines with the really steep side walls, and there was a whole series of them all the way to Alamogordo, and people would, you know, you'd have a perfectly clear day, and then all of a sudden rain from a storm, you know, 50 miles away up, all of a sudden there would be this wall of water would just come tearing down these ravines, and if you happened to be standing in a ravine, you almost didn't have a chance. It was too steep to climb out of, and you were just going to get washed out. And people drowned in those things. They were very dangerous, so they always warned you, don't go hiking up those ravines during the rainy season, because even though your sky was clear, water could come down and smack you from someplace else. And I remember pulling up in front of it was that women's club where we went to church. I don't remember going to primary, and that's really something I can't quite square, because I must have gone to primary.
It says in here that they had very few primary. Specifically, Mom mentions it.
I you know, growing up, I got almost zero primary, almost no primary at all, which is, and I've looked back and tried to put together a memory. I can remember at Vallejo, where she took me to a vacation Bible school run by a Baptist church, and I made a picture of Jesus framed in a red frame with clay at this vacation Bible school. But that's the closest I can remember to a youth church activity as a young man, is making a picture of Jesus in a plaster frame at a vacation Bible school in Vallejo.
It says right in Mom's history that they just didn't hold regular primary, quote unquote.
Yeah, yeah. I think I can almost zero primary.
This is going to be out of context time-wise, but when we were at Edwards, they had a vacation Bible school that they actually did at Edwards Elementary School. And we went to that one time, and I just had a good old time just being among all the people, but you went home and they'd been teaching doctrine that you knew was false.
Oh yeah.
And you told Mom, he says, Philip and I cannot go to that because they don't teach the truth. And so Mom took your advice, and we never went back. And I wanted to go to vacation Bible school.
Oh.
I was too young to understand doctrine that much.
Oh.
I just was enjoying the social, but I'm glad that
Oh, yeah.
I'm glad that Dennis took that stand.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go where there's false doctrine.
Yeah.
Yeah, you remember things I don't remember. But the White Sands, you know, that was fun. It's so unique. I mean, it's such a unique geographic feature, that it's hard to imagine why that was even there the way it was in the middle of nowhere. These brilliant white. And didn't they film scenes from Star Wars and stuff out in those sands? I think so. And I can remember, of course, going to church. I can remember, well, bits and pieces. That was the time when Dad always loved Western things. You know how Dad was.
Always.
And I mean, traveling to New Mexico, traveling to Florida, traveling back from Florida. Ghost Town, Dad was going to stop and see it.
Shakespeare's Ghost Town,
Yeah.
Lincoln County Courthouse, Fort Sumner, all in New Mexico. You don't care to talk about any of those?
Yeah, well, and what is the name of the town where he's buried right up here in Coloma? The brothers, the sheriffs.
Earps.
Yeah, he's buried right up here. He moved to San Francisco in his old age, and his wife was Jewish, so he's buried in the Jewish cemetery right over here in Coloma. But Dad stopped at that town, that ghost town, where the famous, what was the name of that ghost town?
Shakespeare?
No, where the famous gunfight at OK Corral.
Oh,
Tombstone.
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 By the way, I was at Tombstone about 6 months ago.
Yeah, well, we stopped at Tombstone when we moved out to New Mexico.
I remember that.
And I remember the houses made out of bottles. I can remember there was all this shards of broken blue glass.
Yes.
You know, that was before they found a way to keep glass from turning blue, you know. And so all those ghost towns had this stuff. And I remember that particular ghost town, there was broken blue glass everywhere, and the soil everywhere at that time. And so, and I can remember going to the Lincoln County Courthouse. I can remember the baptism. I remember that very, very well.
Talk about the baptism a little bit.
Well, I maybe this is my ego getting away, but I think I kind of put the press on Dad that I wasn't going to get baptized unless he got baptized.
Mom told me that, so it's
Really?
how you go.
I'm not sure if that's, but I remember I told, I'm not going to get baptized unless you get baptized. You know, I don't know how ready Dad was to be baptized, but he knew that he diverted his disaster by getting baptized, because I dug in. I did not.
I remember your dad saying he figured it wouldn't do him any harm and it might do you some good. That's why he got baptized. Remember that?
Dad said that?
Yeah.
That's funny.
Mom told me, you said, I'm not going to get baptized unless he gets baptized.
Yeah.
And it just so happened that the bishop had enough inspiration to turn to him and say, what about you, Glenn? Do you want to get baptized?
Yeah.
And under the pressure that you exerted, he said yes.
Yeah, he did.
Talk about the Apache, the Mescalero Apache reservation and the
Well,
farm.
it was actually a church-built building with a regular fountain at the church. At some point in time, must have built that on the reservation. I mean, there was no chapel in Alamogordo, but the Mescalero Apaches had that up there. It was up in the hills a bit, but it was a regular chapel. I remember, well, you know, in those days before the Indians got the gaming things and found some sources of income, those people were so dirt poor, and I remember that on weekends we didn't generally, we went to town. We were very careful because the Indians would come in and they'd drink to excess and kind of war whoop and carry on, and then come midnight or so, as they're trying to find their way back, they'd fall in the ditches and pass out. And going to school on Monday morning, sometimes there'd be Indians still in the ditches. They wouldn't be dead, they'd just be passed out in the ditches. And I remember this flatbed truck coming down the road, and the Indians would go down there, lift them and put them on the flatbed truck to take them back to the reservation, you know. I don't know if you remember that or not, but it was a real problem, you know, on the weekends, because the Indians kind of came in and took over the town a little bit and drank themselves to excess. But they had a system in place. Here comes the truck, back to the reservation, you know. And I think those days are gone. I understand the Mescaleros are pretty wealthy today. They've done very well. But in those days, that was a very sad lot of people with not a lot of hope. Not a lot of hope. Yeah.
Okay, this one has to come up. I got to ask it. One day, you and I were watching TV. Mom and Dad were in the kitchen. Mom was doing some dishes. And Dad was telling her about something that happened at the base during a lunch. Can you take it from there? What happened?
Well, the story I heard was they had finished firing off all those captured German V-2 rockets.
Yeah.
And there was the new Army WAC Corporal, which is America's first real missile. And a WAC Corporal is launched. And from out of nowhere comes these two objects. And they just kind of swoop in and follow the WAC Corporal right into the stratosphere. And numbers of people saw it. And Dad came home with that story, you know. And of course, that would have been at the White Sands Proving Ground, and Dad was stationed in Holloman, So he may have got the story secondhand, I don't know. But
I found out about that.
it was all the Twitter, I mean, it was, everybody was talking about it.
And Mom asked, was it Russian? He said, no. He said, they think it's not, that it's from space.
Uh-huh.
And I remember we went out in the car that night and they went somewhere and you and I are sitting in the car alone. I'm looking out my window going,
Well, they went into a grocery store and left us parking in the
that's what it
parking lot.
was. I didn't know you were sitting there quaking on your side of the car.
Yeah, because we're
Until
waiting for
years
these
later.
guys to swoop down and take these two, you know.
I never knew for years that I was sitting here in the car going, they're going to come get me any minute. I hope Mom and Dad get back quick.
Yeah, me too.
He's on the other side of the car doing the same thing. It was probably 40 years before we compared notes on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was doing the same thing you were doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, just for a note, back to Vallejo, I remember the first car we had in Vallejo. You undid a nut and you could, the front windows would open out.
Hmm.
They were on hinges. You could actually, and I remember playing with that thing and thinking how the front windows in that car that we had at that moment were, you know, like the old time Model Ts and stuff. I don't know what it was, but those windows folded out. The front windows, you could fold them in and out. But anyway, well, I'm getting us off track a little bit
Yeah.
here.
I'm going to get us off track a little bit more for a minute because I learned something just a few days before Dad died, just before we went into the hospital. He was playing dominoes with Rachel. And he brought it up because for years he did, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know about any space, you know, I don't know anything about that. She's sitting there playing dominoes, he brings it up. And he says, you know, he said as base sergeant major, and he was working for Colonel Bostel, who actually was the base communication officer. He said, everything like that came across my desk. So anything that was going on, I knew. And so that's how I knew about that, was because I read the reports coming across my desk. So that answered that question.
So that's where, because he was at Holloman and this happened at the proving grounds. Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
and I never knew that until just days before Dad died. And then, how did he put it? He says, you know, they were there, they couldn't be there, but they were. Something like that.
Right.
Do you remember how he said that?
He said there are things flying in formation that shouldn't have been there.
Yeah, and you know, he may not have said anything over the years because it was very common for the Air Force to put a zipper on anything like that. Even swear people to secrecy on things like that. And Dad, as a base sergeant major, yapping about it, he may have felt like he would have violated security in some way. So maybe that's why he was so tight-lipped about it.
National security oath.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but anyway, just days before he died, he cleared it up. How did he know? It came across his desk.
Yeah, okay.
And he said they couldn't be there, but there they were. Something like that was the way that she told it to me after he told it to him. Yeah, they couldn't be there, but they were. So that finally solved that mystery. I wondered for years, did Dad see this? Did he hear about it secondhand? What was this?
Yeah.
It came. It was paperwork coming across his desk.
Yeah. Well, you know, I was starting to explore a point, and maybe I should finish it before we move on. Dad loved the Old West, and I was talking about all the
yes,
places.
of course.
So he discovers Old Man Roswell.
Mm-hmm.
And Old Man Roswell is living up on the side of the hill in this cabin, which is about the length of this room and about as wide as to here. It was a small little wood cabin, and he had a pot-belly stove in there for heat, and he had it was an iron frame bed frame and an old gray tick mattress, you know, like they have in those kinds of environments. And Dad would just go up there to pump him for Old West stories, because he must have been at least in his 80s by 1950, whenever it was, 50.
Well, we left there in 54.
So which means that he was a young man through most of the height of the Old West. He told Dad that he is related in some way to the founder of Roswell, New Mexico, and that he knew that one of his personal friends discovered Carlsbad Caverns, because that's one of the things he said. But then he told that outlandish story of the boots, you know, and Dennis, you see them boots over there? Yeah. Them boots killed 3 men. And then he goes on with the story that this one fella's riding through the chaparral and in his horse, and the rattlesnake struck up at him, but just got the edge of his boot. He didn't realize what happened, but he said them fangs broke off in the heels of that boot, just sticking into into the boot just a little bit. And he goes on to tell the story that he got sick and he was weakened, and as he's passing away, he gives these boots to a friend, and the person wears the boots, but it gradually sickens and weakens, and he dies, and as he's dying, he passes it on to a third person. Well, by this time in the story, as an adult, you'd be highly skeptical, but as a kid, I'm just, oh, wow. And finally, this third person dies, and he says, and they are right there. Dennis, you want to try them on? And my eyes get big as saucers, like. And Dad, he doubles up, like, he starts guffawing, he's laughing, because they've just had a great old Western, joke on me, a good cowboy joke on me.
When we went to Tombstone, Dad found Pat Garrett III.
Oh.
And Pat Garrett III told him that story that they had a court case. They were trying to get Billy the Kid's body exhumed from Fort Sumner, where we had seen it, and they were trying to get it sent back to Lincoln County for reburial. And Pat Garrett III was involved in the fight against moving the body. And the judge finally ruled. He said if he wanted to be buried in Lincoln County, he wouldn't have left in such a hurry.
Right.
Case dismissed.
Right. In fact, when we visited there with the family, Carol and I traveling, we stopped at that story had become public knowledge. It was in the brochures. They talked about that in the settlement, that and that whole dispute. So that became, I think, general information down the line. Of that particular story. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great story. If he'd have wanted to been buried there, why did he leave in such a hurry? Yeah, funny stuff. Funny stuff.
I'm adding too much, but I remember that one big wheel on that little bicycle that was in the thing. And when I was a kid, I thought that bicycle was like 10 feet tall, and I was wondering, is that bicycle still there? We went back, Renee and I, and there it was. And it wasn't as tall as me.
Well, at the time when I first saw it, it seemed awful tall.
Well, we were little kids, and that was very big for a bicycle.
Yeah.
And if you're little, and it's very big for a bicycle. But I said, that bike shrunk.
And remember the bullet holes at the bottom of the stairs?
Yeah.
And when I saw it last, they put a plastic cover over it. I think when we went the first time, I think they were just right out inside, You'd see them.
Yeah. Okay. What else? What else about Tularosa or Alamogordo? Anything?
Mm.
Well,
I'm sure there are pieces there, but I'm not touching anything right now.
In the spring of 1954, Colonel Vostell was transferred to Edwards Air Force Base, and Dad had worked with him so well that he asked for Dad to come too, and so he had Dad put in for a transfer, which came through. So in 1954, Mom very pregnant, we moved to Edwards Air Force Base in California, and I'll stop there. Just free base. Just go on and freely talk about. Let's talk about Edwards.
Well, what I remember best about Edwards is that little area where we lived. And I think I found that a few years back when I was looking for it. But they were tearing those houses out too and rebuilding. But I went to where we had lived. But yeah, it was a duplex, which is fairly common, and it was right on the edge of the desert. If you went out our door and looked away from the housing place, you were looking at desert. Joshua trees as far as the eye could see. Off in the distance, there was a road, and which is still there. But and I don't. I'm not really sure I can do justice to Edwards, but I remember that we would actually try to build forts in Joshua trees, which didn't work too well. And I remember that we got to digging tunnels out in that
Would you
sand.
want to go to bed? Yes, you can.
That do you remember those tunnels we dug out in the desert?
Well, some kids before we ever got there had dug a fort, a pretty doggone good fort,
Yeah, that's right.
and we tried to embellish on that.
Yeah, that's
Eventually, that thing when Renee and I went back years later, when we took them out to see the space shuttle land, we went out there and there was still an indentation there
Oh, where the
where the fort had been.
oh, okay.
And I thought, oh, that's pretty good. But remember how when it rained, a little semi-lake would form there.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And we'd put together rafts and try to paddle out on it, which was kind of a fun thing. And then the arm decks, remember
And Buzzy.
and Buzzy, yeah, it got me. You can still see that scar over my left eye where but I give him credit for that. He probably watched more gladiator movies than I did, because we were going at it at swords, and he takes this net and throws it over them. So I'm totally bound up, and then he stabs me through the through the net.
Was that Johnny?
No, this was Buzzy, a kid. And then there was another phase where some other folks were tying ropes around newspapers and swinging them. Remember that?
I remember that.
That business.
I absolutely remember that.
And then I remember we had the airman who was living in the other half of the duplex. He was married to an English wife. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm. I do remember that.
And so she got the brewing beer in her and putting them in her closet. And in the middle of the night, boom! This stuff explodes. Boom, boom, boom! You hear it all through the house. Well, it turns out that she had it in there with one of her she had a very nice fur coat in there, which it totally ruined this fur coat, like an animal fur coat. But he built models, and I was really impressed. He was a good painter. Remember he was building jets. I remember in that period of time, not on Church Street, but the next street over when we stayed with Aunt Lizzie.
On Delmar.
Yeah, Delmar. Now that was isn't that more in the Nestor time somewhere?
Well, we would go there and spend time with her, and
just to
Nestor
visit.
time does work. She had just moved to the new 740 Church Street, maybe 6 months before we moved in with her in 1957. So anything before about 57 is on Delmar.
Yeah, well, that's where I got my second, and I think I got a Panther jet, and it must have been not long after Dad got back. I put together that battleship, and then I got a blue Panther jet, which I didn't do a very good job on. And then at some point in time, I got those four models.
The little cars.
I've still got them in my closet in here.
I know, they were there when we went through her things.
Yeah. But yeah,
No, they were black, yellow, and green.
black, yellow,
green,
red,
and red.
red and green. Yeah,
Yeah, black, yellow, red, and green.
Yeah, one of them's damaged, but three of them are in pretty good shape.
Suts Bearcat. I can't remember.
Yeah, they were. Yeah, that sort of thing. So, but I remember that airman that lived in the duplex at Edwards. He was quite a good model maker. I was very impressed with what he did. I don't really have very many memories of Edwards. I have almost zero memories of going to school. I mean, really zero. I can remember that when Major Murray did that high atmospheric flight, that one of my playmates was Michael Murray, his son, who the very day his dad is up there in the plane Michael falls out of the tree and breaks his arm while his dad's in the stratosphere.